I'm John Lohr. I'm the Vice President of STEM Education for Science Olympiad, which means I have the really fun job of working with all our volunteers and our event supervisors on events and professional development. And I'm super excited to welcome to the Science Olympiad family the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forest Service team. And in particular, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi McAllister, the Acting Director of Conservation Education for the U.S. Forest Service, and she's going to introduce her team and the fantastic people we have on board today.
Hi, everybody. We're really glad that you could make it, and we're really excited to share with you our love of forests. You all probably know that the Forest Service takes care of the national forests, and some of you have probably gone and visited them, as we all love to do. The Forest Service also helps to take care of state forests as well. We work with the states in how they manage their forests. We also work with private landowners and help them managing their forests as well. So we look over the entire nation's forests as well. So that's what we like to do here. And with us today, we have several people to help everybody out. We have Stacy Bender, who is a physical scientist, and Stacy is an earth scientist with the Forest Service located in Salt Lake City. She started her science career as an elementary school science nerd and was also on the Science Olympiad team in middle school. Before the Forest Service, she worked as a meteorologist, hydrologist, and computer programmer for the National Weather Service. Stacy loves all the sciences and loves to explore, learn new things, and get some brain exercise. We also have Chloe Quinn, who is operating those lovely slides for us. And Chloe is an intern with us at the Conservation Education Office of the Forest Service in Washington, D.C. So welcome to Chloe as well. We also have two of our scientists with us today. We have Kevin Potter, who is a forest ecologist and conservation geneticist who works to conserve forest ecosystems and the important services they provide. He's currently assessment manager in the Inventory, Monitoring, and Assessment Research Office of the Forest Service, stationed in North Carolina. In his last job, he was a research professor at North Carolina State University for 15 years. Kevin is a native of Colorado, and he enjoys spending time with his wife, 3 kids, and dog Ollie. We also have Cal Oakley with us, who is a forester at our Southern Research Station. Originally from New York, Cal works in the Forest Service's Southern Research Station, Insects, Diseases, and Invasive Plants Unit in Athens, Georgia. He's part of a team researching how invasive plants enter the country, how they spread through different types of forests, and what we can do to protect our forests from them. Cal also likes birding, foraging for mushrooms and vegetables, and hiking with his dog, Doug. So we're really happy to have all of our Forest Service people here with us. Now, before we jump into questions, we just want to mention a few things that we love your questions and we want you to ask all the questions that you have. Please type them in the Q&A bar. We'll also leave time at the end for additional questions. So some of us will be watching the Q&A and some of us will be setting questions aside for later. The goal of this webinar is to give you tips and tricks from the experts themselves. That's why Kevin and Cal are here. Rather than memorizing all of the trees and plants, this webinar is about strategies and ways that you can organize yourselves. And remember, we will record and share this session so you can come back to it later on if you want to. So with that, we'll move on to our first question, which is, what steps do you take to ID a tree? And I think we'll start with Cal and then move on to Kevin.
Thanks, Heidi. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll just dive right in. So there's all kinds of different trees out there with all sorts of different forms, but there are some basic steps you can always take when you meet a tree that you've never seen before. The first thing that I like to do is decide what type of leaf it has. Here on the slide, you can see a great example of several different types of leaves, ranging from simple to compound leaves. After that, I also, well, not really after, more like at the same time, I also check to see whether the leaves on a branch are opposite each other, like in this picture, or alternate from each other. Because that, along with the leaf shape, are some pretty common diagnostic features, as they're called, of different species. Chloe, if you can go to the next slide, please. Or I don't know who's controlling the slides.
Chloe, can we go to the next slide?
One second, sorry. It doesn't seem to be allowing me to. If someone else maybe wants to take over.
Right. Here, Chloe, see if that'll work for you now.
Awesome. Thanks, Chloe. Here are some other examples of basically vocabulary used to describe different characteristics of leaves, and that's sort of how most people tell different tree species apart. It sounds very obvious, but the key is just to learn, and based on information you'll see in field guides, which we'll talk about in a minute, the different characteristics of a tree's leaves, as well as some other things like twigs and flowers, which I'll talk about in a second. I would like to say, with all this, don't be overwhelmed by all the different words. The point, again, is just that there's lots of different parts of the leaf that you can talk about, like the arrangement or the shape of the margins, or the shape in general, that can all be very helpful for distinguishing one species for another. Could I have the next slide, please?
Hey, Chloe, I saw your comment in the chat. Can we see it? I can see the next slide. It was in oh, it looks great now.
Oh,
Okay,
perfect.
so sorry about that.
Thanks, Chloe. I couldn't do it what you're doing, to be honest, so I appreciate you powering through it. I'll hurry through this a little more because, like I was saying before, the point of showing everyone all of these different words for the different parts of a tree. In this case, we see on this slide the different words for the parts of a twig, and then the different words to describe types of flowers or flower arrangements, and then fruit. It's all just to show you that there's basically a word for every part of a tree, and each species will have certain characteristics that are unique to them, and you won't have to learn how to describe every one of these terms for every species. But what you will learn is that certain species have unique features, and learning these words is helpful for when you're reading out of a field guide or like a Wikipedia page or something describing a species, what to look for when you're actually outside with the tree in front of you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to give some other tips for the actual tree ID itself.
Thanks, Cal. So a couple of thoughts here. First of all, we can back up a couple of slides back to Cal's first one. We'll get to this one in a minute. Details matter, right? And it's really important to pay attention to details, particularly generally the first thing you're going to look at when you're trying to identify a tree is the leaves, right? So that's sort of the first thing to go to. Simple versus compound, that's the first thing that kind of that comes into my mind. Simple meaning it's just one leaf connected, one part of a leaf connected by a stem to a branch, versus what's called compound here, which Cal talked about, where you have multiple leaflets on a leaf. So that's the first thing. That's an important detail to pay attention to. The second most important detail is whether the leaves are alternate or opposite, like Cal said. The trick here is that and here we're talking about non-conifers, so deciduous trees and the like, angiosperms, so trees that don't have cones. Most trees are going to have alternate leaves. So if you see a tree with opposite leaves, you can think, okay, there are only a few kinds of species that have opposite leaves. And there's a mnemonic device to remember that, and it's called Mad Bucking Horse. So if you can remember that, M is for maples, A is for ash, D is for dogwood, bucking is for buckeyes, and then horse is for horse chestnut, which isn't actually a native tree and it's not going to be on your list, but it helps with remembering. So that's sort of a mnemonic device to try to remember that important detail. So if you can go forward to the next slide, again, there are sometimes the leaves are not going to be entirely diagnostic, right? So there are different oak species, for example, that have very similar looking kinds of leaves, and you can go to the next slide after this too. So then there are other things that you have to pay attention to, in particular, the shape and size of an acorn and the saucer, so the top part of the acorn. So those are the kinds of things that you're going to have to pay attention to as well. And if you go to the next slide, you can another characteristic that is often important in identifying trees is the bark. So you have the whole sort of package sometimes you need to look at to identify a tree. And if you get to the point after practicing a bunch, and I encourage you all to practice, you may get to the point where you can identify a tree, like in this case, a dogwood on the left has this alligator looking bark. You can identify that without seeing the leaves at all. You can see it from a distance. You can tell it's a dogwood. In the middle there, that's a white oak. It tends to have kind of a shreddy kind of strips of bark on it. And then on the right is tulip poplar, one of my favorite trees. I saw somebody in the chat say that as well. They have these beautiful, they look almost like Greek columns. They're beautiful, straight, and sort of fluted looking even. So, you know, it's the whole package. Pay attention to the details and don't get too hung up on any one characteristic. Try to see the whole package as well, and practice. And you can practice, I'll say, wherever you are. Even if you're in the city, you can go to the parks, you can go to a park, you can look in your yard, all of that sort of thing. Just be aware, if you're in the city, that some of the trees are not going to be on your list, probably because they're ornamental trees that have been come from other places like Asia or Europe that have been planted there. So don't get too hung up on that. But you should be able to find native trees as well to practice your identification skills.
Hey, Kevin, could you give the mnemonic again?
So MAD, M-A-D, maple, ash, dogwood, bucking for buckeye, and horse for horse chestnut.
Thank you, sir. Right. And then also along these lines, when you were talking about characteristics before we get into the field guides, there's a couple of questions coming through here, looking about like specific kind of trees. And I know you talked about some of the challenges with maples, and you can't just always use the leaf, if I'm remembering correctly. There's a
right. Well,
specific
oaks,
question here about
maples to
pine.
some degrees as well, right?
Sorry about that. There's a question here about pines, and could you talk a little bit about any tips on pine characteristics to look for, or how to handle pine trees?
Sure, right. So we have a lot of pine species in the United States, and my first recommendation, I guess, would be to make sure that you know the local pine species. So get a handle on what those are. I think from what I understand about a Science Olympiad, that's more likely to be something you're going to be tested on, as opposed. So if you're in New York, you're not probably going to be tested on pine trees that are from California, for example. So get a handle on what those are. The characteristics to look for in pines are the number of needles. So we have two basic kinds of pines. We have white pines that tend to have 5 needles, and yellow pines that have 2 or 3 needles in a bundle, fascicle they're called. So that's the first thing you need to look at. Cone structure, so the size of the cone, how sharp the prickles are on the ends of the cone scales is important, whether the cones themselves are kind of shiny or not, and then bark as well. So those are all important characteristics to look for. And we could spend more than an hour talking about how to identify pines. So I think that's not the focus of what we're talking, or what this webinar is about. But we do want you to have a sense of how you approach tackling a difficult set of species like that.
Yep. Thank you very much, sir. Now I think it's my turn to throw out the next question. And there's actually been a couple of things out here about it. Could you guys talk a little bit about field guides and like how you go about using them, and do you have recommendations and that kind of thing? And I think we said, Cal, you were going to kick this one off.
Yeah, thanks, John. So a field guide is a super useful tool for identifying all kinds of organisms in general, but trees especially. What you guys are seeing here are some guides that I like to use. Those left 2 pictures are one's the cover, and then the other is an example of a page from that book. And then the photo a little bit to the right of that, the third from the left, that's a more regionally focused field guide that I like to use. And field guides are great because what they'll do is they'll sort of really help you narrow your search whenever you're trying to identify something. For instance, we were just talking about pines. When you're out in the field or out in the town or the city or wherever you are, and you come up to a pine, you're going to know it's a pine right off the bat. You know, you can be confused if you're new with things like spruce and elm, but for the sake of this, you know, you'll turn to the section of the book that discusses pines. And then I really like this Sibley guide because it uses illustrations instead of photographs. And these illustrations will highlight the key features. Because it's a drawing, they can make it look exactly like they need it to, so that you can see what makes that species unique. Again, with pines, you know, it will show you a little bundle that shows how many needles are in each bundle for each species. It'll show you the length, and it'll give you the number, you know, the actual measurement of that length, or a range of measurements. And it's just very good at guiding your thinking process. This last book that I have here on the screen is not actually a field guide, but it is basically a book full of definitions for the words that you saw on those first couple of slides I discussed. And that's really helpful, again, just so you don't have to remember the definition for every single one of those words, because there's a lot of them, and they're from Latin and Greek, and they can get pretty confusing. You know, if you don't have the ability to buy a bunch of books for this, you know, all these terms can be looked up online. I noticed a question in the chat about structures and where you can learn about them. Just Google's your best friend in that case. Besides that, what else did I want to say about field guides? I'd like to emphasize the field part of field guides. Sorry about that. There's a fire truck on my street. Like Kevin mentioned before, wherever you are, you want to get outside and you want to try to identify trees where they are. You can only learn so much from a field guide without actually taking it out into the field. And when you go out in the field, you will intuitively start to, like Kevin was saying, you put the whole tree together, you see all of it at once. And by combining these different parts of it that really stand out to you, you get to know that tree in a way. Of course, it can be tough depending on where you live. Not everyone's going to be able to go and find every species that's on the list where they live, but just by going and looking for some, or, you know, any trees and trying to identify them, you will build a schema in your own mind that you can work with. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin now, so he can discuss some of the stuff he looks for in a field guide. But if you take anything away from this portion, it's grab a guide that you like and take it outside with you, because you'll learn how to use it, and then you'll learn what you personally need to do to get comfortable with all these different species.
So a field guide that I like and I still use occasionally, I don't know if that's showing up here very well, is the Peterson field guides. There's an Eastern version and a Western version. And like Cal said, it's better when you've got drawings or paintings or the like, rather than photos. So the Audubon field guides are great. I like those as well. They have a lot of great information in them, but it's actually, it can be a little bit difficult, or it can be tricky sometimes using a photo or using a set of photos to identify trees. So I recommend field guides like this that focus more on pictures. And the way this field guide is set up is it has similar species together on a page. Here you see on the top, these are white oaks, and below are red oaks. These are two different kinds of oaks that you should be familiar with. And it kind of points out it emphasizes the important structures that are different between them in terms of what the leaves look like, what the twigs look like, what the fruits or acorns in this case look like in the photos. And then they'll have it has a table on the other side that that has more information along those lines. And then you can page to the back of the book that has more of a description of the species, where they grow, their environments, and that sort of thing. And this book also in the front has some good advice on learning how to identify trees, talking about the kinds of characteristics that we've been focusing on, leaf types and twigs and that kind of stuff. So this is a good one. I would certainly recommend that sort of early on in the process, the Science Olympiad process. If you can advance to the next slide, more advanced, it is this kind of book, and this is actually a college textbook that it's called North American Trees. I just looked it up. It's available on Amazon, and it's actually pretty pricey. And I apologize not that I didn't look that up before, although it may be something you can get in your library. The approach with a book like this is different in that it is based on a key structure. So it has a set of what are called dichotomous keys. So you go to the front of the book, as you see on the right here, and you essentially you look at the characteristic. Does it have opposite leaves or non-opposite or alternate leaves? And then you go to another. It sends you elsewhere in the key, and then you do a choose your own adventure kind of thing to get to the point where you get to the information about the species itself. In this case, this is sourwood. It has some really good information about the species, where it grows, its life history characteristics, its uses, that kind of stuff. So this is really a good book once you start getting to like the national level. So this is all of North America. But you really do need to be comfortable with knowing how to use a key, a dichotomous key. And if you're going to be interested in going into a field like forestry or botany or something like that, or even entomology, studying insects and the like, being able to use a dichotomous key is a really good skill to have.
Thanks, Kevin. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One, any suggestions for winter identification? Some of our people are going to have competitions during the winter, tips for practice or sources for information. And if there's anything that they need to think about with the age of the guide, with the date of publication on a guide.
I can tackle some of those, Heidi. Just addressing the age of a guide, the date of publication. You will find with those, the only challenge will be that sometimes botanists will change the name of a tree on you. They'll change that species name, or sometimes they'll even move it to a whole nother genus. And so the genus might change and the species might stay the same, or they might both change or whatever. That it's typically less common for that to happen with trees as opposed to other types of plants. What I would recommend to deal with that issue is you all have a list of species names, and those names are what you're going to be expected to know. And if you're using a guide and you can't find the species that's on your list in that guide, go ahead and Google that species, because part of naming species is keeping a record of what all the previous names were. So it will be easy to connect it back to your guide if your guide is a little older. It just takes that extra step. But besides that, the only issue I might have with an old field guide is that it has been out too much and it's falling apart. But if you're using a book from a library, hopefully you won't have that issue. Going to the winter tree ID, that's where stuff like your bark, your buds, and other sort of structures that might stay on the tree after the leaves are gone, like fruit being acorns, seed pods, that type of thing, or pine cones if you have a pine. That's where those are all very helpful. As well as something we haven't discussed yet, but we probably will with this next question, I think. But the ecology of a tree can be really helpful in identifying it as well. If you know that a tree, certain species will grow, along streams, and you're in the middle of winter, that's helpful, because if you come across a stream and you say, I think this is this, oh, wait, it's definitely not this other species, because that one grows maybe on the tops of slopes and this grows down by streams. So any of the natural history associated with a tree can also be very helpful in identifying it. Sometimes it's even as simple as, this tree is small or this tree is very big. The leaves aren't the only thing that can help you identify a tree. They are just what people tend to start with. And you'll find as you work with other trees with the leaves on, you'll be noticing these things like the bark and where they grow and that type of stuff. So when they are gone, the leaves, that is, you'll still be able to know that tree. And if you practice with the same trees over and over again, and you see it from one season to another, you'll say, oh, this is what this tree looks like naked, basically. And you'll connect the two things together, and that'll help you learn.
I'd add that there are a surprising number of trees that will hold on to at least a few leaves during the fall or during the winter. So so that's a possibility. Sometimes, there'll be leaves on the ground. You do have to be a little bit careful about that. But again, I would encourage people, when you're trying to identify a tree, to again look at the whole picture. Don't hone in only on one characteristic. You want to make sure that you've got sort of multiple lines of evidence, essentially, right? And with you really can identify trees by buds and by twigs and that sort of stuff. It takes some practice, and again, you got to really focus in on the details, but you can do it. For example, dogwood trees, their buds in the winter look like little Hershey kisses, right? So that's kind of cool. What else? Persimmons have what's called a pseudo-terminal bud, or a false bud at the end. So rather than the bud being at the tip of the branch, it actually is a little off on the side, for example. So those are the kinds of things you need to focus on, and you can do that in the winter, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you both. If we can go on to the next slide. How would you organize your 2-inch binder? And I think with this question, we'll start with Kevin.
Thanks, Heidi. So yeah, to me, a 2-inch binder, you could cram a lot of information into that. So I would be careful. You've got a field guide with you, so don't duplicate the information there. Particularly, you're going to be limited in the amount of time that you can have to put information together. So my suggestions would be to do a couple of things. First of all, would to be sort of put together some cheat sheets on difficult groups. And we haven't talked much about conifers yet, but that would be one that I would focus on. Having sort of a cheat sheet that talks about the different different characteristics of different conifer genera being the plural of genus. So pines, they have cones that hang down, they have needles versus hemlocks that have single needles that are attached with a little kind of what's called a peduncle, a little stem essentially to the branch, and they have smaller cones and so forth, right? So I would focus on that, really get a sense of what differentiates different conifers. Putting together a cheat sheet on difficult angiosperm or flowering plant genera as well. So oaks, obviously we've talked about, they're white oaks, they're red oaks. Trying to get a sense of what the differences between those and what the different leaf characteristics and acorn characteristics are of particular species. Hickories would be another, ashes, maples, the kind of genera where there are multiple species. So that would be a good thing. Having access like Cal suggested to some sort of glossary of the terminology that you may run into. I think having that in there would be pretty helpful. What else? I jotted down some thoughts here. Oh, and from my understanding of how the tests work for Science Olympiad, they want you to be able to talk some about the species beyond just identifying it. So I think it would be helpful to put together information on the natural history of the species, or at least at the genus level. You know, where do they tend to grow? What are their human uses? So economically, so hickories are used for to make hockey sticks. Pines are often used for lumber, that kind of thing. Natural history kind of use. What am I thinking of? Black gum trees, for example, they have fruits that lots of birds eat, for example. So having a sense of those kinds of things would be helpful as well. There are probably too many species to do that for every single species on the list, but do that maybe at the genus level, and then hone in on some of the more important species like white oak, which is famous for being used for barrels for aging whiskey, and loblolly pine is used a lot in lumber and paper and that kind of thing. So I could go on. I think Cal's got some ideas too.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Kevin outlined makes a lot of sense, because like you said, you'll have the field guide, which will help with identification, and you'll be practicing identification, and you'll see as you do that, like you can see on your list, these trees are all related to each other in different ways. And so you'll come up with quick ways of telling, oh, this is this group of trees. I know that real quick, no problem. So the binder, I think, is a lot better used for the information that isn't related to the species itself or the group, or sorry, that's confusing. The information that isn't related exclusively to the tree and the group it falls in and how it's related to other trees. So again, this economic, this cultural use, this ecological value, that type of stuff is less easy to tell just by looking at a list. And it's not necessarily going to be in your field guide either, because that stuff is for field guides are prioritizing identification. Some other things I would encourage you to put in your binder, if you've got space, you can press some leaves if you think that'll be really helpful for you to remember a tricky species. I do think that there are some rules in the Science Olympiad relating to whether or not you can then take them back out during the test. But even just if they're there stuck to a page for you to look at, like you would look at any other page, that could be helpful. Another thing that could be cool to put in the binder, and I think very helpful and a little fun, would be drawings of leaves. Drawing leaves or twigs or pine cones, acorns, all these different structures is a really great way for you to learn the different characteristics of a species in a less, I guess, traditional sort of way. It's not just banging the words into your head and trying to keep them all straight. When you're forced to draw something in detail, you learn it in a sort of deeper way, I think. So when you then look at the drawing that you've made, you go, oh, I remember this, not just because I see the leaf, but because I remember, oh, this is the thing I really had to focus on, and that's what makes this tree special. Other than that, it seems like you can do a lot of stuff with these binders. So I'd encourage you to get creative and just you'll learn as you practice where your weak points are. And I think that's going to be what the type of stuff you want to put in your binder.
Great. Thanks, Cal and Kevin. If we move on to the next question, I think that we're starting with Cal on this one. What is your favorite tree and why?
Thanks, Heidi. So I think asking someone at the Forest Service what their favorite tree is like asking someone who their favorite child is. It's kind of an impossible question to answer. But the tree that I want to talk about right now is one that I've just really been enjoying lately. And that's the Northern Catalpa speciosa. Here's a picture of it here, and I just love it because to me, it seems like a very tropical sort of tree, but it's native to the United States, and it grows as far north as New England, where I'm from. And in the spring and summer, it has these big, beautiful blooms that will cover the whole tree. And I just, you don't see that very much in the eastern forests, these big flowering trees. Most of the trees, their flowers are very drab and small, but these are very showy, and it's just like a big flower bush, except it's 60 feet tall. And I've noticed a couple times folks in the chat have asked what the difference between a northern catalpa and a southern catalpa is. And I'll tell you right now, that's a tricky one to tell the difference between side by side. What I would say is, if you're in any sort of urban setting, it's most likely that you're looking at a northern catalpa. Besides that, I think southern catalpas might have slightly smaller leaves and slightly shorter seed pods. But you'll find as you go through this, anytime you see someone using the word slightly to describe the difference between two things, it's tricky. It's, every tree is always going to have leaves of different sizes. You might be looking at a tree and go, is this a southern catalpa, or is this just a northern catalpa with slightly smaller leaves? I wish I could give you a good diagnostic feature off the top of my head right now, but it's escaping me. So I would just say refer to a field guide, because this is a notoriously tricky distinction, and the guide will emphasize what those differences are. Because I think it's especially tricky just out in the field, because their ranges overlap significantly. Again, though, if you're in any sort of urban or suburban area, I would bet on it being northern catalpa, because it's planted because of these beautiful flowers that I've talked about. That's all for me for now. Kevin, what tree are you going to highlight for us?
So my favorite tree species is one that is not on the list. It is a native of North America. It is, however, extinct in the wild, which is a part of its really fascinating story. I think it's my favorite tree, I would say, and again, it's hard. There's so many tree species that I really love, but I love the story of the Benjamin Franklin tree, right? The Franklinia lattimaha. So this is a species that was discovered by two famous botanists from Philadelphia, William and John Bartram, when they traveled to Georgia in the late 1700s. They brought it. You can see it has these beautiful flowers. Big stately kind of tree, grew by the river. They brought seeds back. They grew them in their arboretum there, named it after their friend Benjamin Franklin, and it began to be sort of distributed around to different gardens, and people were planting it in their lawns and that sort of thing, or in their gardens. They went back, collected a couple of times. I think another botanist maybe did as well. But by the early 1800s, nobody could find it again in nature. So it had disappeared from its native habitat. The thinking is it maybe was there. It existed in a very small population to begin with, as a result of the ice ages and glaciation, changing climates throughout the East, probably. Not that there were glaciers in Georgia, but certainly the forests were different. And there maybe was some sort of large disturbance event like a flood or something like that that eliminated it. But it continues to exist because people have taken the time and the effort to make sure that it continues to exist. And it's planted all over the place throughout the East. It's a little tricky to grow, but it continues. And I think there are efforts, I meant to look this up, but I forgot to do it. But I think there are efforts to reintroduce it back into natural forests in Georgia.
Oh, well, thank you both for sharing that information with us. Those are both wonderful trees. They are. We did have a question in the chat. Is there a quick way to differentiate between pine and spruce?
Yeah, so pines are the needles of pines come in what are called fascicles or clusters. Very occasionally, there will be only one needle, but that is very, very rare. There's a pinyon pine or two out west that do that, but almost always there are at least 2, 3, or 5 needles within a cluster. Spruces, however, have single needles that are very pointy. They tend to be they don't tend to be very flexible at all. So the mnemonic is with spruces is that spruces are spiky. So if you shake a spruce's hand, you're going to feel it, as opposed to a pine where the needles tend to be really pretty flexible and less likely to, be unfriendly in that kind of way.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide. Kevin, we'll start with you. Can you tell us about your journey to get to this career? How did you end up here at the Forest Service?
So I grew up in Colorado. I spent a lot of time. So I'm a city boy. I'm from Denver. There were certainly trees around, but not forests. But some of my most cherished memories from my childhood were going up to the mountains where my grandparents lived, up by Rocky Mountain National Park. Hiking around in the woods up there, and just I think that was really a formative experience for me. When I went to college, I actually got a degree in journalism. I was a newspaper reporter for several years, and over a course of time, I decided that I wanted to take my career in a different direction. Initially, I wanted to be like a natural resources, environmental kind of writer. But the more I did that, the more I was just so drawn and intrigued by the natural world and understanding the threats to our forests and their continued ability to provide important services to us. I was very concerned about that, so I decided to go into research and ended up. So I went to graduate school at NC State, got degrees in natural resource management and forest ecology, and now I'm really fortunate, I think, to be in a position where I can help make sure that we are understanding the ecology of our forests, understanding the importance of biodiversity, and helping to conserve the biodiversity of our forests. And I work a lot with threatened tree species in particular, trying to understand their genetic variation, for example. So I feel very fortunate to be able to do what I do.
Yeah. Cal?
Yeah, so like Kevin, I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors. In particular, I think going to summer camp in Western North Carolina was a really big influence on me and my love of the outdoors and forests in particular. Sort of why I ended up studying biology and ecology in undergrad, and then eventually getting my master's in forest resource management. I ended up, deciding to start my career at the Forest Service in particular, the Southern Research Station, because I'm an extremely curious person, and working at the Southern Research Station meant that I could work with scientists and learn on the job about all types of stuff. And then, eventually, hopefully, what I do here will impact the way that we take care of our forests, because all that time spent outdoors really made me realize that a healthy forest is no accident, and that there's a lot of work that we humans do to help maintain these ecosystems while the rest of the world moves around them. So to be able to contribute to making that happen is really special to me. Yeah, come work for the Forest Service. It's a great job.
Yep, it is. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so very much, both of you. We certainly appreciate your time here. And now we would like to open it up to some more of the student questions. We've been kind of picking a few out of the chat and stuff like that. So maybe if, let's see, I saw a good one in here. Oh, any good way to differentiate between a red maple and a sugar maple?
Yeah, actually, so red maples are everywhere. So be aware of that. They're like, yeah, I should be careful. I shouldn't necessarily say it this way, but they're kind of like the cockroach of our tree world, because they can grow just everywhere. Red maples they have teeth. All maples have teeth on the edges of their leaves. Red maples tend to have pointy edges, while sugar maples, of which there are several different species depending on how you kind of slice them, their teeth tend to be more rounded. And there's some differences in the bark as well. But the main characteristic is to look at the leaves if you can. There are some differences in the seeds as well. I think I should check this, but the leaves of or the seeds from red maples tend to fall during the spring, while the sugar maples keep their seeds, which are called little seeds with wings on them, until the fall.
Sugar maples, at least with the sugar maple Acer saccharum, that species, those seeds are bigger than the red maple ones too. So if you've got some little ones and some big long ones next to each other, those would be the two different species right there.
Okay.
So, yeah, we're seeing a lot of questions about how you differentiate among different things, and I'm certainly happy, and Cal is too, I'm sure, to answer these questions. But ultimately, there are so many different groups that folks are going to have to get out there and delve into the field guides a little bit, look in Wikipedia, whatever, to try to get a handle on some of these things. But there are certainly some that are trickier than others, and there do tend to be characteristics like that differentiate them, and you have to pay attention to those details.
Hey, Kevin and Cal, there's a question that just popped up in the chat, and do you have advice for anybody? So they've narrowed it down to 2, right? And they're really stuck on between, A and B. You have any advice as to one feature you'll look for, or other than flipping a coin, how would you make a guess?
So, well, it's funny you say make a guess, because if I'm out in the field and I really can't tell the difference between 2 species, and or one species or another, and I'm certain it's one of 2, I I would take my best guess, and I would try to include not just the physical characteristics, but all those ecological, natural history clues that I can glean from the environment. A botanist, some very similar species, you can only really tell them apart from things like differences in their flower structures, and flowers don't occur throughout the entire year. So like I said, sometimes you kind of just have to take your best guess. All that said, for species that are commonly confused, and I mentioned this with the catalpa stuff, your guides will typically, or at least the one that I like to use, that Sibley guide, the people who wrote the book know that these trees can get confusing too. So they will say, for instance, I saw some questions about swamp oak or swamp white oak and white oak. The book will say on the swamp white oak, similar to white oak, but this is the difference, yada, yada, yada. A book like the one Kevin suggested is great for that type of stuff because it puts everything side by side. And then it also puts it in a table where, you can check which species have which features, and you can quickly do side-by-side comparisons. Because maybe you're on the field and you just have one tree and you have one leaf from it. The book can basically give you a bunch of leaves to compare right there. So like Kevin said, it's tricky. We could be here all day talking about the differences between this and that, but my best advice would just be to get out there and just start. And you're going to feel like it's a bit overwhelming at first because there's a lot of trees. And if you're not used to working with plants, it can be hard to see the difference between, a very hairy leaf and a slightly hairy leaf. But as you go and interact with more and more leaves and trees and barks and all these different things, the words in the field guide will make more sense to you. And I know that makes it a bit hard to study because sometimes you don't always have time to go out there. But if you're putting in a bunch of work at your desk and you get to go out every so often, you will notice improvement after you get out there.
I have another question here that I think is interesting. What is forest management? What does it mean for a forest to be healthy? And what do y'all do to keep forests healthy?
That's another big question.
That's
What a
a
good
huge
question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. So I do work within the forest health world. And forest health is difficult to define, but essentially a healthy forest is one that is able to remain a forest, that provides the ecological and economic and aesthetic, so beauty, all of those services that we need from it, right? How you keep it that way, it really depends on the situation, allowing natural succession to happen, dealing with making sure that you're dealing with insects and diseases that may become issues, understanding those things, thinning out a stand possibly, which means sort of cutting out the trees that you don't want so that you can encourage the growth of the trees that you do want. So all of that sort of ties into what forest management is. And it really depends specifically, or it depends, forest management and what it is and what it entails depends specifically on the site that you're interested in and what you want to get from the forest. So it's really, if you're interested in a challenging kind of science that really sort of has an important impact on the world, I would encourage you to look further into that.
Yeah, I've heard forestry described as a science and an art, because like Kevin just outlined, it gets pretty complex, and you're sort of trying to balance all these different needs of both people and society, but also the plants and animals in a given location. So definitely try to learn more if you're interested in forest management. And I'm sure a lot of you are in high school, probably thinking about college. If this is something that interests you, I didn't know about this before undergrad, but look for schools with forestry degrees. That is a major you can have, and it will dive into all sorts of stuff like this. I was always attracted to it because it is a lot of hard science, but then also some cool applications of those sciences. And again, that's what forest management is taking what we know and implementing it in a way that is good for forests.
Hey, guys, can I ask along those lines? There were a couple of questions in here asking about either Forest Service programs or Forest Service resources that might be like aligned to student interest or that students could participate in. Anything that comes to mind, or any place we could direct people to take a look?
We have the Natural Inquirer, which it's not specifically focused on topics that you would see at the Science Olympiad, but generally speaking, it is, you have met two of our scientists, and our PhD scientists publish peer-reviewed papers in journals, and we take those articles and turn them into articles that are written for the general public and for students, and we publish them in something called the Natural Inquirer. And if you go to naturalinquirer.org, you can find all of the different ones that are there. There are lots and lots and lots of different topics. Another thing that the Natural Inquirer has is scientist cards, which can give you information on all of the different subjects that our people work on and all of the different careers that are available at the Forest Service.
Thanks, Heidi.
So one thing I want to add, and I hope this doesn't sort of blow everybody's mind, but sometimes even experts can't identify what a tree is. I've seen some comments about that in here, and there can be multiple reasons for that. So with oaks, for example, different oak species sometimes, or pines and other things, can hybridize, and they can get offspring that look kind of halfway in between things, the parental species. And if you're out practicing enough, you're bound to run into that sooner or later. So if you can't identify a tree to a species, it's okay, right? Don't get too hung up on it. Species, to some degree, are a human construct, right? We use species as a way to identify the world and to put things into bins. The natural world doesn't always work that way, and that's okay, right? For the Science Olympiad, I'm pretty sure the folks testing you are not going to put you in a position where you can't identify a tree. I'm guessing that it's going to be pretty clear. But understand that the natural world is messy and complicated, and as a result, I think really awesome and intriguing and beautiful and all that sort of thing. So again, practice. If you can't identify a tree, it's okay. Don't get too hung up on it, but keep working at it.
Here's a question for you, Kevin. I think, in forest management, how would you handle invasive plant species? And we've seen some other questions about emerald ash borer and things like that.
Yeah, I think Cal works with invasive plants too. I do some, so
Okay.
the kind of work I do is less management of invasive plants as opposed to just getting an understanding of where they are and what kind of impacts they're having. Cal, do you do management related stuff with invasive plants?
I'm mostly focused on research of specific plants and the general ways that plants become invasive,
I
because
see.
as some of you probably know, there's probably trees planted all around you and all sorts of plants planted all around you that are not from here. People plant stuff all the time because they just like it for its aesthetics or its fruit or what have you. But for one reason or another, some species escape our control and then negatively impact the natural ecosystems wherever they are. What we do about them depends on a lot of different factors. This is forest management, it's going to depend on what the invasive species is, where it's invading, and which of the functions of that forest is it interfering with. Something that we're studying, my team is studying right now, is wild sugarcane in South Florida. It's not a native plant, but we're concerned about it because it grows very quickly and grows very tall, and the places that it is invading sometimes have wildfires, and when that sugarcane catches on fire, it burns really hot and burns really tall and is dangerous for the people living nearby, and also can hurt the other plants and animals in that ecosystem in a way that they are not used to. What we do for that, it's tricky. I'm sort of rambling now because it's a very broad question. And like I said, it depends on where you are, what sort of things you're trying to maintain, what ecosystem services you're trying to maintain, and then what resources you have to work with. We are the Forest Service, but we are also limited sometimes in what we can do. And so it's all about picking your battles, I think, really, when it comes to invasive species. For things like chestnut blight and emerald ash borer, those are pretty well documented forest pests and diseases. And unfortunately, they're also at a stage where they've done a lot of damage already, and we're sort of just protecting the individuals of ash and chestnut that we have left, to ensure that if we do find a solution for those things one day, we can then hopefully restore those species. I know there's a lot of cool stuff going on with American chestnut, and the American Chestnut Foundation is a great resource if you're interested in learning more about that. The emerald ash borer, I believe the research on that is at a slightly younger stage, so I can't speak on that in very great detail right now. It is a big problem, though. It's really unfortunate.
All right. Hey, everybody, I just doing a time check, and we have gone over our time, and the Forest Service team has been gracious to hang around longer than I asked them to, and thank you so much for doing that. But we're going to go ahead and wrap up at this point. Next steps, we've gotten a ton of questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everything. What we're going to try and do is we'll pull them together and see if we can't put together some answers for you that we'll post on the Science Olympiad website. There's also Kevin's been throwing up a bunch of great resources and links that will get stuff out. And also thank you, Stacy, for the Natural Inquirer link. But if you guys would just say thank you to the U.S. Forest Service team. It's been awesome to have you guys, and thank you so much. You will be getting the copy of the video. We'll get you the PowerPoint. We'll get you some other information as well. It probably will not be tomorrow, but really plan on early next week. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to the Forest Service. Wish you luck on your season, and hope to see you at another one of our events this year.
Sure. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. And we love all of these questions, and we will work to get you answers. We will figure that out. There just wasn't enough time tonight. But thanks for joining us, and best of luck.
Yeah, I'm jealous. I could be out there identifying trees.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
luck.
Practice, practice, practice.